agreement keeping protocol. This is one of the highlights of this workshop that I did, and this is, I've talked to a few of you about this idea of how leaders make a lot of agreements and then they ask for lots of agreements. But I have never outlined the agreement keeping protocol quite as fully as I did in Boston, and I've been talking about this for years. So I'm just going to flip through this quickly. This is too fast for you to take notes, but each of you have access to the recording, so you can come back to this if it's useful. And we'll even make a little separate little nugget on Dave Ellis TV, because I think this is an unusual and a powerful way that Joanne and Bill and I and everybody else I've worked with have agreed to handle agreements, which is after you make them, you've got some options. One of them is to keep it. But we've got to give people a lot of other options other than keeping it, because otherwise, if you don't have the option to not keep it, I claim you don't have the option to keep it. So sometimes it's hard to keep it. Maybe it's almost impossible to keep it, and it's at risk. So the option is to report when it's at risk. And then sometimes even renegotiate it, which means when you are having trouble keeping it, but you know you still can, that's the important part, you know you still can, you go to the person you made it with and say, hey, I'd like to change this agreement if it works for you. But there's another option, which is you rescind it. That means you say, hey, I made it, but I'm taking it back. Now, I know a lot of people think, well, that's like breaking it. Well, I don't think so. I think it's way better than breaking it, because when you rescind it, the person knows before you don't do it that you can't be counted on. And when you rescind it, then you also have the option to either revoke it, which means you're not going to do it. Hey, I said I was going to be there at 5, but I'm not going to be, and I won't see you tonight. Or revise it. Hey, I know I said I was going to be there at 5. I apologize. I'm not going to be, but I'll be there at 6. That's revising it. But I also want to make it okay to break it. Now, I know a lot of people don't think it's okay to break an agreement, but my concern is if it's not okay to break it, it's not okay to keep it. Because anytime we don't have freedom, it's really hard to follow through with what we said. Now, there's a little bit more to this agreement-keeping protocol, and in a few minutes I'm going to turn the floor over to you and listen to what you have to say about all this. But first of all, I want to talk about when you break it, of course, then what do you do? Well, you got some options once again, and one of those options is to hope nobody finds out. And that's an option that a lot of us follow. But there's another option, which is to report you broke it. And, of course, as soon as possible. But if you don't report you broke it, and instead you use number 1, which is hoping nobody found out, but they found out, then it's a good idea to agree you broke it. The protocol here is that if you reported it or if you agree that you broke it, then you apologize. I'm recommending apologizing without a reason, or at least a really short reason, because if you apologize with a really, really long reason, it's almost like you're justifying that you broke it. And then, after you apologize, you either recommit to it, if it's an ongoing agreement, or you renegotiate it, or you rescind it. And of course, if you rescind it, then you can say again, well, after I rescind it, I'll do it again. Now, what about when somebody else breaks an agreement? Well, I think it's great if you acknowledge it soon, if they don't acknowledge it, and then you pause for a response. Now, the other person might apologize and then recommit, renegotiate, or rescind, or the other person might give you a bunch of excuses, or the other person might point out all the agreements you broke or that other people break because they get defensive. Now, of course, if that happens, I recommend that you just listen. Appreciate something about the person after you've acknowledged that they broke it. And then, if they haven't already offered, ask them to recommit or renegotiate, or rescind it. Well, there's a few ideas about one of the highlights from the Boston workshop. Before I go to the next one, I want to pause and I see that several people, other people have joined the call, but I want to pause and have you say something back about this whole concept. So leave this on the screen for a minute and ask that you raise your hand and say something about this. It's a little talk about leadership, because this is something that if you are in a group, you could take this kind of a protocol, or you could develop your own, and then you could go to the people in your group and say, this is how I'd like to deal with agreement keeping. So say something back to me about this. Push 1 on your keypad. I'll call on you. Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, Dave, I really want to say something about this because I think it's so crucial and so important. I mean, it's so easy to make an agreement, so hard to keep it.
Yeah.
And the person who breaks an agreement often feels, incredibly encumbered by the burden of having made the agreement to begin with. And it's not that you want to permit wide latitude for people not to have the integrity to maintain their agreement, but there are occasions where you also don't want to put somebody in a corner for having made an agreement. Now, all that said, I made an agreement to do some writing. I basically kept that agreement, but I know on several days I didn't. And boy, have I been sweating it out. And when I couldn't get on the call last week to confess my sins, I felt particularly bad, and I felt like it was like some sort of divine punishment for not being being able to get on the call that I hadn't kept those agreements. But I do think it's important because it's all too human to fail.
Right.
And with it, it's very it's generous, it's gracious, it's all those good things to be able to allow that kind of latitude.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. Now, congruent with what I just talked about, just for fun, given that you've just let us know and reported, we didn't have to ask you. You acknowledged it, that you broke your agreement, and so now you have this option of either recommitting, or renegotiating, or rescinding. And what I love is that you acknowledge that you broke it, and you didn't give us a big, long reason. So do you want to renegotiate, rescind, or recommit?
Well, you left off the option of lying.
Well, I like that option, too. That's one of the, I just think we got to, once in a while, people lie. But tell me, again, so you made an agreement after your coaching that you were going to write every day, something like that, and you didn't do it.
Out of the I guess roughly 13, 14 days that passed, I probably wrote about half of those.
Great.
But so the good news is I wrote more consistently than I've written for a long, long time.
Exactly.
So that's the good news, and I get it. I mean, I just get what it takes, which is really strange because it didn't take that much.
Yeah.
But the other part is that it is a very odd thing to make a promise like that and not keep it. And I really did feel the burden of not keeping the promise.
Right. Yeah. And what I'm trying to do, Richard, is suggest that it not be a burden. Because if it is a burden, and if it continues to be a burden, people won't make promises.
Exactly.
So It was only the promise is intended to be like rocket fuel. It's intended to be a motivator, but not a burden. When it becomes a burden, I recommend you rescind the promise and let the light back into your life, and only have the promise if it doesn't have any shame around it, or any blame around it, or any burden around it.
I would have done that. I would have rescinded, but I couldn't get through on the call last week.
Well, no problem. So you promised to spend an hour every morning writing. And now, do you want to now rescind it, or do you want to recommit, or do you want to renegotiate? Maybe give us a different promise.
Yeah, well, the promise I have now, and the one that's easy to keep because I have formed the habit of doing it, it's just writing more consistently in the mornings. I mean, it really is phenomenal how just kind of making up your mind that's what you're going to do. It's so weird. We build up these artificial impediments, like I've got to get to work. I don't have time to write. Well, the fact of the matter is that work is still there when I get there. It doesn't go away, and it's still there. So, you know, the impediment of me having to get to work wasn't real.
Yeah, excellent. Hey, Richard, thanks, and thanks for practicing this agreement-keeping protocol. Now we're going to go to Kathy Dunn. Go ahead, Kathy.
Hey, Dave. So this is a little different spin on the same idea. We saw each other, you and Bill and I and everybody else in Boston over the weekend and Monday, left there, went to another meeting in Boston, just got back tonight. On my way back, a colleague of mine and I had a commitment to meet tomorrow to work on a project that we've been working on for publication for a long time. And she called to say that she needed to do a conference call in the middle of the day. Well, not the middle of the day, but 10 o'clock. We were going to meet at 8. So I said, no problem. I have a lot of work to do, and that's fine. And then I thought about it, and I said, that's fine, but if I spent this time here before I met you there, I could be more productive in meeting our commitment. So while she was renegotiating her agreement with me, I thought I was able to renegotiate what my agreement with her was in our renegotiated agreement, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And it's a great practical example, Kathy, because I believe that we all run into problems with our agreements. And what I want to do is take all the shame away and take all the burden away. But at the same time, of course, you keep it when you can, but sometimes it really just doesn't make sense. So you report that it's at risk, or you just say, hey, I could do it, but I'd really like to change it, like you did. Because it sounds to me like so great example.
Thanks.
All right. And one more comment about this, and then I'm going to go to one more highlight from Boston. Brent, you got the microphone.
Hi, Dave. I'm thinking of parenting as we're having this discussion, and in my family, I've had this motto, and that is that a promise made is a debt unpaid. And so, for me, there's not a lot of latitude if the kids break an agreement. And I found that a lot of times I impose my will in the way of an agreement upon the kids. So this has just been really, really beneficial for me. And I guess the other thing that I'm looking at is I've always been hard on the easy stuff and easy on the hard stuff. So if this is the first time my kids ever messed up in this area, where they've done something really serious, I've always had a tendency to be easy on that because I figure that's a hard thing for them because, it really, really pressed them to make a decision, or maybe there's some peer pressure involved. It was just a hard decision for them to make, and if they went against that. So I have had a tendency to be easy there. But I could use some coaching on this.
Yeah, well, thanks, Brent. I actually think you're great self-discovery, and I hear an implied intention, which is to shift the way you've been with your kids about agreements.
Yeah.
Yeah. And because the problem is when we impose, that's what you said. You said in the past you've used these agreements to impose your will on your kids. Well, in parenting, sometimes, particularly when the kids are a little bit young, that works. But as they get a little older and rebellious, it doesn't work so well. And it really doesn't work in 21st century leadership, because in the past, in the old last century and the centuries before, leaders really could shame their followers into behavior. And it still works for a few people, but it doesn't work in general. Telling people what they have to do, what they must do, like you have to commit to this, you must commit to this, you better promise me this. I mean, sometimes people will do it, but they won't follow through because they really didn't do it on their own. It was an external locus of control rather than an internal locus of control.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Brent, and thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Richard. Those are great examples.